Welcome everybody. My name is Felix Eduardo NALLIM. I am a doctor and geriatrician. I am master in social gerontology. I am president of Argentine Gerontological Association, AGA, also president 22 World Congress of Gerontology and Geriatric, IAGG 2022, Buenos Aires, Argentina. I have the great honor to introduce Dr. Thomas SCHARF, United Kingdom. Thomas SCHARF is Professor of Social Gerontology in the Population Health Sciences Institute at Newcastle University, UK, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. Professor SCHARF is current President of the British Society of Gerontology. His research addresses issues relating to social inclusion and exclusion in later life, often with a focus on the spaces and places in which inclusion and exclusion arise and on the policies responses to form of exclusion.
The title of my lecture today is Reducing Inequalities, Promoting Inclusion in Later Life. And what I thought I would do was to focus on three themes over the course of my lecture. I want to say a few words at the beginning about inequalities in later life and the way in which these are conceptualized. I'll draw attention to some evidence relating to inequalities among older people. And then that provides a bridge into exploring issues around social exclusion, thinking about exclusion within its multidimensional context, and using evidence from a range of places to think about the ways in which exclusion affects older people. The context for my focus on inequalities and on social exclusion is the United Nations Decade of Healthy Aging. And drawing the various threads together, what I'll finish up with is some thoughts about how societies might respond to inequalities that characterize later life and also risks of exclusion. So beginning with a focus on inequalities, here I'd like to draw on some work that colleagues and I conducted a few years ago now that explored in a more systematic nature the range of ways in which inequalities are represented in England, but also as part of this work, we considered the different ways in which researchers have tried to explain inequalities. So there's a certain trajectory involved here, with the initial work on inequalities drawing on a political economy of aging perspective. This then moves into ideas that have influenced life course approaches, emphasizing the notion of cumulative advantage and disadvantage. And in recent years, there's been a much stronger orientation on intersectional approaches, focusing in particular on questions around age, sexuality and gender identity, race and ethnicity. What I would say from the review that we conducted is that there are also other approaches which help to explain advantage and disadvantage in later life, but these have been rather less well picked up in the literature. And I would include social exclusion as an idea here, but alongside that, we have evidence of work around capability theory, more recently around precarity in aging, and also the notion of vulnerability. The political economy of aging perspective goes back to the 1970s and 1980s, really, and this sought to represent advantage and disadvantage in later life in terms of structural characteristics of societies. So Alan Walker argued here that with his focus on poverty, that poverty in old age is primarily a function of low economic and social status prior to retirement and the depressed social status of the retired, and only secondarily of the relatively low level of state benefits. So the argument here is that people are poor, they're disadvantaged in later life because they've been disadvantaged during their early years and during their adult lives. He goes on to say social policies which have failed to recognize inequality in old age and the causes of low economic and social status have therefore failed to tackle the problem of poverty and low incomes. The life course approach builds very neatly on the political economy perspective. It also targets structural conditions of inequality, but here relates this to change over time at both the level of generational groups, but also of individuals. A key component of life course approaches is the idea of cumulative advantage and disadvantage, a notion that reflects the idea that the same birth cohorts may become much more unequal over time. So groups that were born in the early post-war, post-Second World War period in North America and Europe, as they age, they become increasingly unequal. A life course approach can also consider the impact of early and adult life on outcomes in later life. So, for example, the influence of limited educational opportunities, poor access to labor markets, low levels of income, all of these impacts earlier in life and the way in which they influence experiences of later life. As Rand argues, I think very eloquently, origins and destinations in the life course are linked by patterns of appreciation, depreciation, and compensation of life course capital that are highly complex and interdependent with age. Moving on to the third way of exploring inequalities in terms of conceptualizations, we have recently witnessed a shift towards intersectional approaches. These clearly display overlaps with a life course perspective. The intersectional approach has been described as a knowledge project whose raison d'etre lies in its attentiveness to power relations and social inequalities. And I think significantly, depending on the different groups which one considers within an intersectional approach, this can be associated, as Clark and McCall suggest, with potentially different interpretations of the same facts. This intersectional framing often leads to an analysis of multiple and even conflicting social dynamics that enable certain kinds of social understanding that are otherwise invisible when scholars focus on a single set of social dynamics. So by concentrating simply on age or on gender or on race and ethnicity, we can often miss the way in which these characteristics, these social locations interact and produce either positive or negative outcomes for particular groups within an aging population. And in research on aging, we typically identify an intersectional approach in relation to characteristics of race, social class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nation, ability and disability, as well as age itself. And there are countless examples of research that draws on different characteristics of older people in an intersectional way, considering power relations, uneven power relations across social groups. So, for example, work around older lesbian, gay and bisexual adults, work that considers age, race and ethnicity, gender and education collectively, and also work around men's aging that considers gender, race, class, nation, and sexuality. These various ways of understanding inequalities are also then reflected in an enormous range of evidence around the unequal nature of aging in many countries right around the world, but I inevitably draw my evidence from England, from the context that I'm most familiar with, but I'm sure colleagues in other countries would recognize similar evidence in their particular places. So if we just take a simple set of data around life expectancy, in this case, disability-free life expectancy, what we can see is that people living in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods live much more of their lives with disabilities than people who live in the least disadvantaged neighborhoods. As Rachel Cooper has argued here, people from more deprived backgrounds live shorter lives and live much more of their shorter lives with disability and in poor health. And this was a feature of societies before the COVID pandemic alerted us to the deep-seated nature of inequalities in many places. We also see evidence of inequalities in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic itself. In England, in the early stages of the pandemic, deaths relating to COVID-19 were twice as high in the most disadvantaged, 10% of areas compared with the least disadvantaged areas. Right, these are the two bars on the right of the chart here for each of the months in the early years of 2020. So double the rate of deaths in disadvantaged areas compared to advantaged areas. And we also see the value of an intersectional approach, of an approach that combines characteristics such as ethnicity, occupation, gender, age, disability, place of residence, that these characteristics are all associated with much higher mortality rates during the early stages of the pandemic in countries like the United Kingdom, like England. And this chart shows age standardized mortality rates for confirmed COVID-19 cases based on ethnicity and sex. And essentially, white populations had a much lower mortality rate than any other of the ethnic groups represented in England. So what the COVID pandemic tended to do was to draw attention to the deep-seated and persisting nature of inequalities in later life. Inequalities based on all of those social locations, age, gender, ethnicity and race, social class or socioeconomic status, place of residence, and care relations. What this implies is that the nature of later life is unnecessarily diminished in quality and in quantity for key groups in aging societies. For older women, for people who belong to minority ethnic groups, for people who are supporting family members as informal carers. These groups experience a reduced quantity of life and also a reduced quality of life. From our evidence review that we conducted just a few years ago, it's clear that the strongest evidence that we have relates to inequalities in physical and mental health, in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy, and also to a slightly lesser extent to financial security. What we identified were some gaps around themes such as inequalities in well-being, in social relationships, in people's access to neighborhood resources, and also a lack of evidence relating to the increasing diversity of aging populations, which would allow us to explore that intersectional approach rather better in our research. The work on inequalities in later life has a really long pedigree in gerontology. But I think one of the characteristics of a focus on inequalities is that this sometimes is an abstract idea that draws attention to differences, draws attention to unfairnesses, to inequities between key social groups, but it doesn't actually tell us very much about the experiences of later life for groups of older people. And this is where I think a social exclusion framework can be really helpful, that this allows us to move beyond the abstract idea of inequalities and to think more about implications of unequal aging for older people's lives. Social exclusion has been framed as a multidimensional process of progressive social rupture, a process that detaches groups and individuals from social relations and institutions, that prevents people from full participation in the normatively prescribed activities of the society in which they live. So the idea here is that people who are affected by social exclusion don't have the same quality of life, access to the same opportunities of life as a general population. In a substantial body of work that I was involved in with colleagues led by Kieran Walsh in Ireland, we had the opportunity to think about knowledge gaps and social exclusion of older people and to assemble a state of the art, if you like, of knowledge around the different dimensions of exclusion in later life. This occurred through the mechanism of a so-called cost action, an action that focused on reducing old age social exclusion called RoseNet. We drew together a large network of researchers and policy stakeholders from a number of world regions, not just from Europe. We had this helpful support of an older adult reference group to make sure that older people's voices were well represented in the work that we did. And together we set out to think about where the evidence was fragmented in terms of our knowledge around social exclusion in later life, and thinking about gaps and places in which we could be innovative in conceptual terms. So here, overall, we set out to address a disconnect between research and policy with a long-term view of contributing to reducing exclusion of older people. So we now know, much more based on that collective knowledge and intellectual capital. We know so much more about the key features of exclusion in later life. And this also draws attention to some of the things that we would have been aware of in relation to inequalities in later life. So there's a strong life course dimension to understanding social exclusion in older age. We know that some forms of exclusion increase over the course of people's lives. So into advanced old age, we know that risks of loneliness may increase after the age of 75 or 80, depending on people's characteristics and the society. And for some people, we also know that particular risks of exclusion can be regarded as chronic features of people's lives. So people who were living in poverty in early adulthood may continue to live in poverty across the course of their adult lives and into older age. A second characteristic of exclusion in later life is the idea that being excluded in later life is in some way qualitatively different from being excluded at earlier stages of the life course. A key contributing factor here are the natural declines in health, in functional health, in some cases in sort of mental health that are a feature of growing older. Also, older people's lives may be characterized by contracting social support and social networks. This means that older people may have fewer opportunities to escape from social exclusion than people at earlier stages of the life course. So people who are poor in later life tend not to have as many opportunities to escape poverty in later life without some form of formal intervention by the state. And picking up on the intersectional idea that underpins recent work on inequalities, we know that some groups are disproportionately affected by multiple forms of social exclusion. And this is the framework that we developed as part of the RoseNet collaboration. We identified exclusion as being a complex process that involves the lack or denial of resources, rights, goods, and services as people age, and also an inability to participate in normal relationships and activities that are available to most people across different domains of society. And we generated this multidimensional social exclusion framework, which I think has come into its own over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we're able to draw on this framework to show the different ways in which people have been affected in later life by in important spheres of life by sort of characteristics of the pandemic. And I'll just say a little bit about each of these domains of exclusion, just to emphasize the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the multiple ways in which older people's exclusion became visible over the course of the last 2 years or so. So if we start off with exclusion from services, amenities, and mobility, there's been a major focus in research and in policy and practice on digital forms of exclusion. So as countries have moved to digital forms of service provision, older people who lack access to means of sort of digital communication have become more disadvantaged, finding it more difficult to access information sources over the course of the last 2 years or so. We also have seen reduced access to health and social care services as a characteristic of our societies, as services have withdrawn from communities, as countries have rolled back on welfare entitlements and formal forms of service provision. Older people have experienced, like many others, restrictions placed on their access to commercial services and use of commercial services, and also key components of the transport infrastructure where that exists have either been cut back, or people have found it difficult to use public transport. In relation to exclusion from material resources, this also has a number of different dimensions. On the one hand, in countries like the United Kingdom, we see that many older workers have withdrawn from the labour market, with the implication that they're now living on lower incomes and maybe sort of managing less well to support themselves on a reduced income in later life. This emphasizes the growing poverty risks faced by older people in many societies. And with the reduced incomes and rising costs that are characteristic of the COVID period and the post-COVID phase, there's growing evidence of people cutting back on essentials of food, of heating, of socializing in order to manage their limited resources. There's been a major focus during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic on the impacts on people's social relationships, both in terms of the quantity and quality of social interactions. And risks of loneliness and of isolation are spread very unevenly across our aging populations, with some groups being disproportionately affected by loneliness than other groups. And in many countries, and this continues to be the case in countries like the United Kingdom, where access to care homes is still rather restricted for family members, we see that there are particular challenges relating to the social relations of people who are living in long-term care settings. A key feature of social exclusion debates is a focus on sociocultural forms of exclusion. This is a broad category of indicators relating to such characteristics as ageism and age discrimination. The United Nations in their work and the World Health Organization have drawn attention to the upsurge of ageism and age discrimination over the course of the pandemic. We also have a growing body of evidence around forms of exclusion that tend to other older people, to separate them out from key groups within society that marginalize older people. An example of this is reflected in the pervasive negative images and the types of language that have been used to represent older people in public discourse. When it comes to neighborhood and community features of social exclusion, a key element here is the ability of people to manage their daily lives in the places and spaces in which they are aging over the course of the pandemic. So there are real differences in terms of the quality of urban and rural environments in relation to whether people can maintain a normal life. So people who are restricted, who have lack of green and access to green and blue space, for example, have a much different later life to those who are surrounded by nice public parks, who have access to the coasts, to rivers, to lakes, to areas where there are many leisure facilities and a sufficient quality and quantity of amenities. And the final aspect of exclusion, which it's worth drawing attention to over the course of the pandemic, is exclusion from civic participation. And what we witnessed here were countless examples of older people who were prevented from contributing to civic activities in the way that they were used to doing before the pandemic. So a reduction in opportunities to volunteer. Older people's voices tended to be ignored in policy making, but older people became almost instantly voiceless over the course of the pandemic, and even people's basic rights in terms of expressing their views, of participating politically and engaging in civic activities. This was not always respected as it should have been respected, especially in long-term care settings. So what we find in terms of evidence around social exclusion in later life is that the risks of exclusion vary according to factors such as age, gender, ethnicity and race, socioeconomic status, place of residence, and care relations. So the similar factors that affect inequalities in later life. The evidence of social exclusion amongst older people is strongest in relation to people's material resources, their social relationships, and access to services, amenities, and personal mobility. I think reflecting the work of the RoseNet collaboration, we still come across knowledge gaps in terms of exclusion from civic participation, exclusion from neighborhood and community, and particularly a framing around socio-cultural aspects of exclusion, embracing issues around ageism and age discrimination, which are not typically drawn into the social exclusion discourse. And I think reflecting more widely on the experience of RoseNet is that there is now much better evidence around exclusion in later life in European countries, in the European region, and to a lesser extent in sort of North America and Australasia. But there are entire world regions, I'd say, where the social exclusion approach to considering unequal aging is rather less well developed. And I'd probably say that this may be the same in terms of a focus on inequalities. So drawing the threads together from work that has been done on inequalities in later life and on social exclusion in later life, I'd like to finish up with some thoughts for the United Nations Decade of Healthy Aging. I think one of the really encouraging features of the work that's been invested in the United Nations Decade is the way in which responding to inequalities and promoting inclusion are identified as key priorities within the decade. And I think that is something that's really important. It makes the job of researchers who are working on unequal aging much more straightforward because we have a clear policy target for the work that we've been doing. But what we also need alongside that prioritization is a much stronger focus on taking the practical measures that are needed to reduce inequalities and to prevent and ameliorate risks of social exclusion in later life. This is always the case of the devil being in the detail. And this isn't something that the United Nations or the World Health Organization can do on their own. It's not something that public health bodies can do on their own. This really does require a whole system response, a response that brings into the mix researchers on aging, government at all, at national, regional, local level. It involves the public sector, but it also involves the private sector and in particular the community and voluntary sector. That there isn't going to be a response to inequalities, to social exclusion risks in later life without involving all of these components of society. And that then means that we need to be developing aging strategies locally, nationally, and internationally that really ensure that that whole system framework is in place. I would also say that one of the lessons of the pandemic in particular, especially for people like me who historically have been perhaps a bit skeptical about the value of a human rights framework for older people. I think one of the lessons of the pandemic is that there is now a pressing need for a convention on the rights of older persons, that this is a task that the United Nations really needs to prioritize and member states need to begin to support. The pandemic has shown that ignoring the rights of older people leads to disastrous outcomes in terms of quality and quantity of later life. We also need to draw on lessons from research that emphasize the value of the life course approach and also the intersection approach as a way of addressing the unequal power relations that are associated with advantage and disadvantage in later life. So this implies interventions across the life course. It implies taking resources away from some groups and giving resources to other groups who are more marginalized. And any component of an action plan on unequal aging has to focus on these 6 dimensions which are reflected in our social exclusion framework. This means reducing poverty and material deprivation, I would say at all stages of the life course, developing responses to loneliness and social isolation, again, right across the life course, ensuring that people have access to the necessary services and amenities that can add quality to people's lives and maintain their personal well-being. We really do need to ensure that older people are involved in any work directed towards reducing inequalities in later life. So civic participation of older people is crucial. The pandemic experience has emphasized, if it were needed, the value of tackling ageism and responding to age-based discrimination across our countries and regions, and also the value of investing in strengthening the necessary connections of individuals to home and community, not just in older age, but again, right across the life course. So those are my thoughts on inequalities and social exclusion in later life. I'm looking forward to responding to any questions that people might have at this point. So thank you for your attention.
Hello, everybody. I'm Professor Jauregui. I'm very glad to thank Professor Thomas SCHARF for his awesome presentation this morning here in Buenos Aires. So, Professor SCHARF, thank you very much. There are no any questions. Thank you, and it's a pleasure that you have in our World Congress this day.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been my pleasure to record the lecture.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.